Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see everybody here, close to the holidays. And if I don't see some of you before, I hope everybody has a very happy Thanksgiving. This is our last Dean's Lecture of 2019 of a calendar year. And I think you'll agree with me that we've had a terrific series of Dean's Lectures. And I hope you all will have received the email announcement that came out with the schedule of lectures for 2020. I do encourage you to come and learn from your esteemed colleagues on a variety of topics that are relevant to the school and its mission. The Dean's Lecture Series was established to provide an opportunity to highlight the extraordinary work of our newly appointed and promoted professors. Attaining this appointment represents an incredible achievement by our senior faculty and confirms not only the respect and the high regard of the school, but also of colleagues across the country and indeed across the world. Today's event will not disappoint. We are privileged to hear from Dr. Peter Zandi. It is an honor to introduce him as today's Dean's Lecturer. Dr. Zandi is a psychiatric epidemiologist with expertise in genetic epidemiology, pharmacoepidemiology, pharmacogenetics, and mental health informatics. We're proud to call Dr. Zandi an alum of the BLOOMBERG School. He earned both his MPH and his MHS in his MHS in biostatistics, and a PhD in mental health. Peter joined the faculty in the Department of Mental Health in 2001 and rose to the rank of professor in 2016 and was vice chair of research for the department in 2017. Now, he recently switched allegiances, and his primary appointment is now in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences across the street in the School of Medicine, and he was named the Arlene and Robert Gogud Professor of Mood Disorders. And I was just talking to Peter before, and he did say that mental health was still his intellectual home. So that's good. And he maintains a very, very... I don't understand the air quote. Yeah, sure. Sincerely from my heart. Yeah, really. It's his intellectual home. And we're delighted that you still feel that way. And we will always consider you one of us, for sure. Peter co-directs research for the Johns Hopkins Mood Disorders Center, where he's engaged in translational and multidisciplinary research to understand the causes of severe mental illnesses, particularly mood disorders, including depression and bipolar disorders. He is committed to developing more effective strategies to reduce the burden of these illnesses in the population. In his genetic epidemiology work, he leads a dry laboratory that uses statistical genetics and bioinformatics tools to manage, analyze, and interpret high-throughput genomic data from genome-wide association, expression, sequencing, and epigenetic studies of complex psychiatric disorders. In his pharmacoepidemiology work, Peter investigates pharmacological strategies for the treatment and prevention of severe mental illness using both observational as well as randomized study designs. Bringing together his interests in genetic and pharmacoepidemiology, he studies the pharmacogenetics of safety and efficacy responses to psychotropic medications with the goal of developing genomic predictors that can be used to personalize treatment and, importantly, prevention strategies. And finally, if that weren't enough, Peter has been working to develop new approaches that leverage emerging health informatics technologies, such as electronic medical records and mobile technology, for carrying out the next generation of large-scale psychiatric epidemiologic research. We're so pleased to have Dr. Zandi here and to present today's Dean's Lecture, and we welcome you to your intellectual home. Sure.
So thank you. I do have to apologize. If I had known you were going to read that, I would have made it a lot shorter and spared everybody falling asleep that was bio. So I apologize. It was a little longer. So yeah, this is. I'd love to say it's good to be back at the School of Public Health, but I feel like I've never left, even though I've switched my primary appointments over to the Department of Psychiatry. It does. The School of Public Health is my intellectual home and my spiritual home. And so really, people ask me, how does it feel now that you got a new primary appointment and you got a fancy title to go along with it? And it really doesn't feel any different. I'm still commuting 4 hours a day back and forth. So my life has not changed. And some might say it's even gotten worse, but we won't talk about that. In fact, maybe we should talk about that. That might be more interesting than probably one. So the talk is the future. Well, actually, the original title was The Future of Psychiatric Epidemiology, but that seemed a little grandiose to me. So I've qualified that, or at least as I see it. So I'm going to bring in elements of how I've been thinking about the future of psychiatric epidemiology as I've been going through my research. To begin with, disclosures, sadly, none. But I'd like to change that. In thinking about how to start this presentation, I thought I'd start with the word cloud. And I hate word clouds. They seem so meaningless to me and pointless. But when I do think about the future of psychiatric epidemiology, it does bring to mind a jumble of buzzwords that form a cloud that people throw around with the promise that it's going to really revolutionize the way we're doing the work that we're doing in mental health. But nobody really knows exactly what those words mean or how they all fit together. So I think a word cloud is an apt sort of metaphor for how I think about the future of psychiatric epidemiology. But for this talk, actually, I'm just going to focus in on 3 buzzwords. I apologize. I'm going to be talking about buzzwords, and they are buzzwords. And I'm in particular going to be talking about measurement-based care, learning health systems, and precision psychiatry. And I'm going to talk about my work in these 3 areas, what they mean to me, and how I think about how they go together, and how I'm thinking about using these ideas to advance the kind of work that I've been doing for the past 20 years since being here in the School of Public Health in my intellectual home. So for the outline of the talk, what am I going to present? I'm going to step through 4 questions. What is the problem that we're dealing with that I might even be thinking about the future of psychiatric epidemiology? What is the problem that I've been working on that's been challenging? What is the solution, and how are those 3 buzzwords that I just showed in the previous slide, how do they relate to the solution that I'm thinking about? What can we do? What can we, the royal we, as a school of public health, as a school of medicine, Hopkins, be a part of that solution? And then finally, what are the challenges? So I'm going to step through each one of those. So what is the problem? Since I was a student, as the dean said, I came here as a student in 1998 to get an MPH and then stayed on for a doctoral degree. I started working in the Mood Disorder Center with Ray DiPaolo and Kay Jamison, studying bipolar disorder. We were studying the genetics of bipolar disorder to understand the causes of the disorder and to use that information to try to develop more effective treatments for the disorder. And so I've been working on that ever since. It's I can't do math anymore from now till 1998. So over 20 years. It's longer than I care to admit. And that's what we've been working on. Bipolar disorder, I don't think I need to spend too much time with this audience in describing what bipolar disorder is. We all know it's a disorder of mood where individuals with the disorder will cycle through periods of manias where they have elevated mood to the point that gets them into trouble, where they're hyperexcitable. They engage in risky behaviors. They start to experience delusions, oftentimes, of paranoia and grandiosity, and they get into trouble because of that mania. And then they will go through periods of depression, where they have a low pathologic mood, lose the normal pleasures and the normal things that they usually do in life, start to think about suicidal ideation, and they may cycle between these mood episodes, interspersed between periods of euthymia where they're doing relatively well. It is a very burdensome disorder, both on the individual, the family of the individual who suffers from the disorder, and on public health. You may all be aware that bipolar disorder really is a spectrum of disorders. There's the narrowly defined bipolar 1 disorder, which is individuals who experience true manias. Bipolar 2 disorder, they'll experience what are called baby manias or hypomanias. They don't meet full criteria for those manic episodes. Schizoaffective bipolar disorder, this is bipolar disorder where they'll have features that are similar to schizophrenia, where they'll have periods of delusions and hallucinations. All the way to cyclothymia, these are individuals who will cycle between manias and depressive episodes that don't meet the full criteria that we want to see in our DSM manual. A little bit about epidemiology. So we know that the prevalence of bipolar disorder, if we're talking about the narrowly defined bipolar disorder, is around 1% in the population. Broadly defined, up to around 4 to 5% in the population, so very common. Risk factors. We really don't know a whole lot about the risk factors. We know genetics play a large role. Heritability is between 60 to 80%, which makes it one of our most genetically determined, that's the wrong word, but one of our most genetic psychiatric illnesses up there with schizophrenia. And really what's surprising is there's no well-established risk factors, environmental risk factors for bipolar disorder. So genetics clearly plays an important role, but it's been proven remarkably challenging to identify what are the specific genetic factors that contribute to the disorder. We're chipping away at it, but it is taking a while. There are also effective treatments for bipolar disorder. Certain classes of medications are very effective in treating patients who have bipolar disorder, ranging from lithium, certain anticonvulsants, atypical antipsychotics, and antidepressants. The problem with these medications is, they've all been discovered by serendipity for the most part, clinical serendipity. We don't know why or how they work. It's remarkable, even in this day and age, that we don't quite know what is the therapeutic mechanisms of action by which these drugs are able to treat patients with bipolar disorder. And we don't know which patients are going to respond to which medications. So when patients come in to the clinic in the mood disorder center, oftentimes they have to go through a period of trial and error to find the right medication that will work for them. And oftentimes it's a long, arduous journey during which they will continue to suffer clinical symptoms and be at risk for problems. So it's a challenge to treat therapeutically. Lithium treatment is one of the most effective treatments for bipolar disorder. It was one of the first that was discovered with clinical efficacy for bipolar disorder. It's a very simple compound. It's can't be patented by pharmaceutical companies, which makes it an interesting medication. But it is remarkably effective both for treating those acute manic episodes as well as for maintenance. When a patient is euthymic, the idea is that patients should stay on lithium treatment, and that will help prevent relapse either into a mania or into a depressive episode. And the data that I'm showing here is from a meta-analysis back in 2004, which really cemented the evidence base that lithium is an effective treatment and really is the basis for many of the recommendations that say lithium should be a first-line therapy for bipolar disorder. And as you can see here from this meta-analysis, that clearly those folks on lithium are doing better in terms of probability of relapse when they're on maintenance therapy with lithium compared to placebo. And it turns out to be one of the more effective treatments for bipolar disorder. And we also know from long-term observational studies that around 20 to 25 patients will remain stable on lithium long-term. If you get them on lithium, they can do really well and be very productive on just lithium therapy. Kay Jamison, who is a co-chair of the Mood Disorder Center, who many of you may know over in the School of Medicine, she's a person who suffers from bipolar disorder, and she's done very well on lithium therapy. And the notion is around 20 to 25% of patients will do well. The challenge with lithium is, and you may all know this, is that it's got a very narrow therapeutic window. That is, if you go too high on the dose, you run the risk of toxicities. And if you go too low, then it won't be efficacious for the patients. So doctors have to monitor lithium levels on a regular basis. And I'm in the School of Public Health, right? So I can say this: doctors are lazy. They don't want to. They don't want to monitor. They have problems with this extra layer of monitoring patients on lithium therapy. So they'll prescribe some of the other medications that have been introduced as a first line. So atypical antipsychotics are increasingly prescribed as a first-line therapy over lithium therapy, even though lithium therapy has a very strong evidence of being remarkably effective. So this sets up this really important question. It would be great if we could identify patients who are going to respond well, to lithium before they get started on treatment. So we didn't have to go through that period of trial and error, and we could get them started. And those 20 to 25% of the patients who are going to do well on it, we can get the right medication to the right person at the right time. And so that's where the first buzzword comes in, this promise of precision psychiatry. The notion is that if we have 5 patients in front of us, that we treat 5 patients with bipolar disorder over here, we know from clinical experience and epidemiologic experience that around 2 of them are just not going to do well right off the bat, and we're going to have to switch treatments. Another 2 might do okay for a bit, but we're going to have to either augment with another medication or switch to another treatment. And here's that 1 in 5 patient that's going to be stable. Here's the research question. Can we identify predictors of this patient before they start treatment so that we can get the right treatment to the right person at the right time. And there's good evidence to believe that there's a lot of things that might contribute to that prediction, but genes play a real strong role. And so over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of my research has been about, let's identify these genes that predict this person who's going to be a good responder so that we can actually do something beneficial clinically and get the right person started on the lithium treatment right away. And so I've been involved in a lot of research over the last 10, 15 years that has set out to address that seemingly simple research question. Let's identify the genetic predictors that predict response. So our group got involved in this large international consortium called CONLIGEN, Consortium of Lithium Genetics. It was a consortium of 22 sites around the world. And as part of this effort, we set out, we were going to recruit patients with bipolar disorder and retrospectively assess them for whether they are good responders or poor responders to lithium. We came up with a scale. One of our colleagues, who's a leader in the field, the ALDA scale, developed this scale to try to retrospectively ascertain this information about patients. And after several years of working together around the world, we got together around 2,500 patients who we had retrospectively assessed for lithium response, and we carried out a genome-wide association study to identify genetic predictors. Now, I'm going to assume that with this audience that everyone knows what a GWAS is and genome-wide association study is and a Manhattan plot, because I think we've all heard about it. You don't need to know exactly, but I don't want to spend time on that. But this is the results which you get from a genome-wide association. It's a Manhattan plot. And each one of these dots represents a SNP that you've tested. Is it associated with, in this case, good response of lithium versus poor response? And what we're looking for are some SNPs that cross this magic threshold p-value here because we've tested 1 million different SNPs across the genome. Now, what might be remarkable from what we know about GWAS, 2,500 samples at the time seemed like a real remarkable achievement, but that's really pittance when you're talking about genome-wide association studies for psychiatric disorders. But so remarkably, we actually found a genome-wide significant finding, these several SNPs here on chromosome 21 that fell in a long non-coding RNA that seemed to be associated with good response to lithium in this particular study. So very exciting. So we took those SNPs and we went into a follow-up sample. In this case, it was a prospective sample, a sample that we had followed prospectively. It was 73 patients from a VA cohort. And we genotyped that one SNP that was associated here in this GWAS. And we found that those with a minor allele, shown here in the orange, just had a much higher relapse rate than those with the wild type genotype, suggesting that maybe there was some element of replication with this genetic finding. So we're very excited about this finding. It's a large consortium. We found one SNP, that's great. But you're not satisfied for many reasons. One is we want to replicate. This is a sample of 73 people. And we know from genetic studies, these findings are very fickle and we want to be able to replicate it. And we also know that while genetics are important, it's not going to be explained by one SNP. There's going to be multiple genetic variants that are contributing to response. And so we want to be able to identify those. So we're encouraged, we're excited about the finding, but more work to be done. And so those of us who had participated in the CONLIGEN effort got together to try to carry out what we thought was the gold standard pharmacogenetic study to answer this very specific research question. The idea here is we're going to do a prospective study. We all know the problems of a retrospective study, trying to retrospectively assess patients for lithium response. Let's prospectively follow patients over time. Even more, we're going to get all our patients, we're going to get them down to lithium monotherapy. You may or may not know, when patients come into our clinics, oftentimes they've accumulated numerous numbers of medications to treat their illness as sort of like a fossil record of the care that they've received over the past 10, 15 years. And oftentimes those medications, having that many medications is a bad idea. So it's not... in the mood disorder center, they often try to get them down to monotherapy to begin with and start from scratch to see if that'll be a good treatment for patients. So as part of this prospective study, we're going to prospectively follow patients, get them down to lithium monotherapy, and then follow them for 2 years for relapse. And then those patients who relapse, we're actually going to switch, do a crossover to another medication, another anticonvulsant, and follow them on a new medication. Because if you really want a pharmacogenetic predictor of SNP variant that predicts response, you not only want to see that's associated with good response or poor response with lithium, but that it's not good predicted of another medication, that it's specific to lithium. That's really a gene by drug interaction effect. And that's really the pharmacogenetic effect that you want to have a specific pharmacogenetic marker. So we said, let's do the gold standard because that's what we want to do. We're good scientists and we're going to do the gold standard study to identify the genetic predictors. So we put in a grant. I did the power calculation, and through some magic scientific sleight of hand, I said, you're only going to need 600 people to do this study. Let's not talk about that right here. We're all friends in this room. We know that in hindsight, that's wildly ambitious. But we got funded at the time. We recruited 11 sites around the world and set out to carry out this gold standard pharmacogenetic study of lithium response for bipolar disorder. So we're working at it, trying to recruit patients. 4 years, sites spending all their effort trying to recruit patients. And after 4 years, we recruited, sorry if the numbers are too small, around 350 patients in total, when the target goal was 600 patients to begin with. Even worse, about half of the patients followed up, that we were trying to follow up, got lost to follow up, so we have no idea how they did on treatment. And we had to shut down the crossover arm because it just wasn't feasible. We wanted to use all the resources to look at the lithium arm first and then worry about the specificity of effect later. That's the realities of doing science. We know what the ideal is. We know what we need to do. You just can't do it. So we did, but regardless, we had data on 300 subjects, and we had genotype data. We did GWAS on them. This is the Manhattan plot, and none of our SNPs crossed the magic threshold, perhaps not surprisingly given the small sample size. But even more discouraging was the fact that those 2 SNPs that we found in the Acknowledgements study did not replicate. So those of you who've been in the business of psychiatric genetics know this story. You have an initial finding where you're kind of excited, you go to try to replicate it, try to do something better, and it doesn't replicate. It's just the nature of what we've been doing as part of psychiatric genetics. And it's frustrating. You know what you need to do. You have a very important, very specific research question in front of you. You try to do it, and it doesn't, and you can't get the answer you want. So really, it's at this point you got to ask yourself, what gives? You know, what's going wrong here? And this was in my career. I was starting to think, well, do I want to continue to do these kind of studies where I'm spending people's money, spending time, and not getting any answers from them that we want? What can we do differently to change the equation here? You know, this is a solvable problem. It's an important research question. It can be solved because we know genetics contribute to it. We should be able to identify it. What do we have to do to solve it? And making things worse, you know, it's around, you just mentioned Thanksgiving. Next week is Thanksgiving. So I'll have to go home, and invariably every holiday, my siblings will say, so, you know, any progress with bipolar disorder? They do it now just to troll me because they know the answer. Well, no, it's a complex disorder. And you just get tired of saying that same answer, that it's a complex disorder. And there's got to be an answer. And my siblings, they're smart. They're smart people. And they say, well, what's wrong? Why can't you solve this question? And so thinking about it, and the hypothesis, it's a simple thing, and we all know it. We've all been talking about it now, is that, you know, the fundamental problem is, we need more data. We need to be able to follow more patients, and we need better data on those patients. We need large sample sizes and better data on those. And we all know from the work that we do that those 2 things are at a fundamental tension with each other: larger sample sizes and deep clinical data. Everything that we've been doing has been a trade-off between those 2 up until this point in our research. So what are we doing wrong? You know, what's interesting is the genetics used to be the complicated, the expensive part about the work that we were doing. Now that's easy. That's cake. You know, at the time it was $250 per subject to do a GWAS genotype. It's even cheaper than that now. But it's expensive to get that information on patients, to follow them prospectively over time, to have detailed information on what medications they're on and how they're doing on those medications. We tried to do it in the PGBD study through the traditional research study designs that we were doing, and it was just too difficult. So what can we do? We know that around greater than 500,000 patients in bipolar disorder in a given year are on lithium treatment in our healthcare centers around the country. They are being treated with lithium and they're being followed. That's 500,000 people that we should have information on what's going on in their lives. So the proposal, can we capture data as it is generated in the real world in a way that doesn't burden the real world in terms of time, effort, and costs, so that we can more efficiently drive discovery of those genetic predictors of lithium response with larger N and better P? I probably should use different words than N and P, but larger N, better P. So that's what we got to try to do. And so that leads to this next question. So what is the solution? How do we do that? How can we achieve that goal, which we know we need to do? And so here, I think the future of psychiatric epidemiology, and it's a future that we're all wrestling with, folks doing epidemiology are thinking about. We're just encountering it in the kind of work that I'm doing. I think there are two major forces of change. This is not radical. Everyone thinks about these things. The first is the advances in the omics. These are my definitions, by the way. I don't know whether people like them or not, but I think they're good definitions of omics and informatics. There is definitely rapid advances in omics. The global and increasingly exhaustive assessment of typically molecular states or activities at different levels of typically biological organization through high-put technologies. So we can talk about genomics, epigenomics, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. There's also these forces that advances in informatics, the set of tools and approaches for capturing and analyzing data of our digital footprints as we move through the parallel digital universe. Again, my definitions, I don't know if people like it, but I think that's what informatics means to me. And I think that the advances in both these areas are really driving, I think in an exciting way, the change of what we want to do in the kind of research that we want to do. And I think those forces are creating three targets of opportunity that were relevant for the kind of work that I wanted to do, that I sat down and conscientiously thought about, where do I want to focus my energies if we really want to make progress in the kind of work that we're doing. And so really the first target of opportunity is here with the wired self. This idea of mobile apps or wearable technologies where we can follow patients through these wearable or mobile technologies and get high resolution digital data from patients or individuals out in the real world. The internet's another target of opportunity. Online communities, social media activity, Google searches, or other online organizations like 23andMe present an opportunity for doing the kind of research that I was interested in that space. And then third and finally are this opportunity of integrated health systems. This becomes another target where we might want to focus to do the kind of research to answer the questions that I was asking about lithium response for bipolar disorder, especially with the rise and increasing use of electronic medical records across these integrated health systems. And so because I was particularly interested in severe mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, these patients typically are less reliable as research participants. They turn out not to be good historians either. We know this when we're talking with patients. We often don't get a reliable history from patients with severe mental illnesses. And also because I was interested in treatments and treatment effects on the disorder, obviously the integrated health system became what I thought a place where I wanted to focus my energy, right here as the target of opportunity. I thought this was the best space to focus in on to try to do what we were doing before, but do it better. And so that's when I became interested in our second buzzword of the day, learning health systems. So this is a figure and a definition of learning health systems that comes from this paper that was an outgrowth of a series of meetings that were held by the Institute of Medicine to expand on and propose and promote this idea of a learning health system. You can read the definition here of learning health system yourself. The way I define a learning health system is this idea is as patients are coming into our care in our health systems, we're going to do research on them. We're going to collect data and do research on them to learn what works, what doesn't work, and then we'll have a platform for translating those findings directly back into improved finding and creating what folks in the who in the know like to call a virtuous cycle of where practice informs research and research informs practice. And I was really attracted to this idea of a learning health system because I thought that this might be a perfect model for getting at the question that I was wrestling with. Can we identify genetic predictors for lithium response to bipolar patients? As our patients are getting care and as they're getting prescribed with lithium, can we get a blood sample, get DNA, see and correlate genetic predictors with how they respond while they're in our care, take those findings, and ultimately hopefully translate it back into improved care for those individuals? Seemed like an attractive idea, and so that's why I became attracted to the idea of a learning health system. It's not a new or novel idea. It's just a new buzzword. We all know, those of us in the psychiatric epidemiology world, that the Scandinavian countries have been way ahead of us in this idea of using health system data to inform what their studies of psychiatric mental health illnesses. Bill Eaton, who's here, sorry, I was going to point the laser at you, has been a leading person here working with the folks in Denmark, and Danny and her colleagues now have collaborations. So it's a vibrant source to address the kind of questions that I'm interested in, and it is an important source. I tend to think of it as a passive system. It doesn't have that sort of active nature of a learning health system where you're taking findings and then automatically translating it back into improved findings. That's one piece. There are also centers here in the US that had the same sort of notion, these integrated health systems like Kaiser, where again, it's a passive system, although, they can embed research in those centers. I was interested in taking this one step further, creating really an active learning health system. And the other part of this is when you look at the players in the field, Hopkins was really underrepresented. Hopkins has lagged behind in this idea of a learning health system. And so I saw an opportunity for trying to get Hopkins involved in this space because I thought it was important. So that leads to this next question. What can we do to be a part of that solution? And so I've been involved over the last 5 years now on 2 initiatives with the goal of creating a learning health system for mental health. That's that acronym up there, LHS-MH. Gotta have an acronym. So there are 2 initiatives that I want to talk a little bit about right now that I've been working on for 5 years to really try to implement this idea of can we create a learning health system for mental health and mood disorders. The first is this initiative. It's MyCare or MyCare, as we like to call it. It stands for Mental Health Integration of Care and Research Enterprise. And then the second initiative is the National Network of Depression Centers Mood Outcomes Programs. These are both attempts that I've been involved in with my colleagues to try to implement this idea of a learning health system for mental health. So in trying to think about how to get this off the ground, because there was nothing like this at Hopkins 5 years ago, started to think about what are the key components of a learning health system. And really, they're this. There's the first part is there has to be active data collection from our patients during that care encounter. Data is key. Structured data is even better, and we want to be capturing on a regular routine basis from our patients so we know how they're doing. There has to be a platform for integrating that data so that we can analyze it, generate results, and then a mechanism for feeding back those results into translation to improved care. 3 key components of a learning health system. But really what's fundamental, I think the driving force of a learning health system is this first part, active data collection. And that's actually just another word for measurement-based care. And measurement-based care is a concept, is our third buzzword of the day, that has gained currency in the field of psychiatry of recent. And I think the novelty here, it's not novelty, but the thing that we tried to do, our colleagues and I, when we're thinking about building a learning health system, was to capitalize on this idea of a measurement-based care to serve as the engine for driving this virtuous cycle of this learning health system. So measurement-based care. The systematic use of established measurement tools to monitor how our patients are doing over time in order to guide clinical care and also collaborative treatment planning. I think that's an important element as well. It was an idea that's been around for a long time. It's not revolutionary, but in the early 2000s, folks in Texas started working deeply in this idea of using measurement-based care in psychiatry. And a lot of studies over the last 10 years have been done to identify what are some of the key elements of a successful measurement-based care program. The first is the measures need to be routinely collected, not only as screening's not enough, but continuously as we're following patients over time. The measures have to have established reliability and validity and sensitivity to change. These are well-established measures with psychometric properties. The third, the results need to be made available to the clinicians in real time so that they can use them to guide clinical decision. If you get the measures, put it on a clipboard and stick it underneath the desk like you do in some waiting rooms in some offices, that's useless. It's going nowhere. It's not a good measurement-based care program. It's not something you want to deal with. And finally, the results should be interpretable for patients so you can use it as a way of enhancing patient-engaged care, a collaborative treatment between the patient and the provider. 4 key elements of a good measurement-based care program. And also in doing research over the last 10 years on measurement-based care, the interesting thing about it is doing measurement-based care not only is good for the sake of tracking how our patients are doing, but there's solid evidence that it improves outcomes. By measuring how our patients are doing and using that information, it actually improves treatment outcomes in a variety of mental health disorders. This is data from the first randomized trial of a measurement-based care program with blind raters on outcomes. It's a relatively small but really well-designed study of 120 patients who were followed with depression, followed up for 6 months. And you can see the Kaplan-Meier curves. This is time to a response as measured on the outcome measure and remission. And here are the people in orange are on standard of care, and in green are those getting measurement-based care. And this has been replicated over and over again. Just by measuring and using that information, you are actually improving care. And there are many reasons why that's the case, but I won't go into that today. So much evidence so that SAMHSA really has added measurement-based care to its registry of evidence-based practices for mental health. But surprisingly, there's barriers to doing measurement-based care. When my colleagues and I first started going around to the clinicians in the Department of Psychiatry saying, look, we want to implement a measurement-based care program in your clinic, there was reluctance and resistance. There was a barrier to it. This is just 5 or 6 years ago when we started this discussion. And when he boiled it down to it, I think there are three main barriers that we were wrestling with. The first is just the burden of capturing measurements. I said, clinicians are lazy. I was being facetious and a little harsh, but, they're busy. And they don't want to have to break out a piece of paper, do a measurement, look at it. Anything that causes friction in the clinical encounter is going to be a barrier for the patient, for those clinicians to adopt it. And especially if we're talking about paper-based, which is what we were talking about 5 years ago. We're going to give them a clipboard with a PHQ-9 on it. And what good is that going to do? The second objection was there really was a suspicion on many clinicians' part, that these objective measures, especially patient-rated, really don't reliably tell me anything about the clinical outcome that I don't already know. So why should I go through all the effort up here if I don't really think they're going to be useful measures to begin with? And then the third barrier was, in the early days, measurement-based care program, the idea was you would do these measurements and then they would be tied to clear decision algorithms. And clinicians didn't like the idea that they were going to be told what to do based on the outcomes of these measurements. But over the past 5 years, we've really worked on ways to overcome those barriers. The burden of capturing measurement. So electronic data capture now is more feasible. We're building these tools in electronic medical records so that there's not that friction. There are a lot of measures now that are widely used, and clinicians are starting to accept them more because of the large literature base and evidence base on their use. And now we focus more not on prescription algorithms based on measurement outcomes, but really as another piece of information that they can use for clinical decision support. And there are also drivers of adoption of measurement-based care. Medicare is changing the way that they reimburse from volume to value. And so the macro legislation in 2015 dictate that these measurement-based care metrics need to be evaluated in order to get reimbursed. And the Joint Commission, which is the commission that's responsible for accrediting healthcare services, has revised their standards for behavioral healthcare to explicitly state that these measurement-based care metrics need to be captured on their patients. So there's a lot of reasons that are driving the adoption of this. And so that's when I went to the leadership of the Department of Psychiatry and said, let's start this My Care initiative. The idea was that we're going to get funding from the Department of Psychiatry to support a team of technicians that was going to work to develop and implement tools that leverage EPIC, our electronic medical record, to integrate clinical care and research so that we can support measurement-based care programs across all our clinics in the Department of Psychiatry, and then use that to drive the adoption of learning health systems across the Department of Psychiatry. This is just a figure of some of the tools that we build as part of this My Care team that we've put together. Data capture tools within EPIC through the patient portal, patient rated as well as provider rated. And we can pull data from EPIC to show to our clinicians how the patients are doing over time or for research database questions. We're developing all kinds of tools. And we're doing this in collaboration with the ICTR team under Dan Ford and Diana Gumas and Bonnie Woods, who lead this effort for all of School of Medicine. We're doing it specifically for the Department of Psychiatry. So our first effort was to engage a Bayview community psychiatry program. I don't know if you know, over on the Bayview campus, there's a large community psychiatry program. This is a picture of their new state-of-the-art facility over there in Bayview. They provide a range of services: outpatient, intensive outpatient, mobile, wraparound, rehabilitation. On the adult side, they treat around 4,000 patients per year. And on the child side, around 1,500 patients per year. We engaged with the leadership of Bayview CPP with the goal of creating a learning health system in mental health here at Bayview. We wanted to enable measurement-based care in all our CPP clinics. So all clinics are going to be capturing standardized measures on their patients continuously throughout follow-up. We're going to be able to pull those data so that they can meet their quality reporting requirements. And then we're going to be able to pull that data together with EPIC for collaborative research across the whole entire community psychiatry program. And so that's what we've been working on for the several years. We spent a lot of time developing and implementing the program with the clinic leaders, we decided on a set of standardized measures that would be captured as part of routine care. Every time our patient comes in, they come into the waiting room there, the main waiting room in Bayview, and we have tablets set up. They register for their appointment, and the questionnaires, depending on what patient they are and what clinic they're being seen, gets fired up. In real time, the clinician then can go into the medical record and see the longitudinal results of each of those measures and go over that with the patients during the clinical encounter. And at the same time, we're pulling all that data into a research registry database of Bayview CPP and linking those standardized measures with other EPIC electronic medical record data. So we actually were in the 4th week of piloting this at Bayview CPP. The first day, the power went out in the center and they had to evacuate the building. We don't think it was due to our program. The next day it went up, and they've been operational in the last 4 weeks. We're getting feedback to try to improve what we're doing, which is why we're doing the pilot, because we really do want to reduce the friction so that the uptake is maximal. So the patients and providers see this part of routine care, and they see it as a valuable part of their routine care. And so that's what we've been working on. It's really gotten us excited, and we're already starting to think about the next steps of this Bayview Learning Health System for mental health. And I hope you can see the possibilities here for doing the kind of research that I was talking about at the beginning. So the first thing, we're talking about establishing a biorepository. So every patient that comes into our clinic, we're going to consent them and collect a biological sample so that we can do translational genomics research. We'll be able to test this idea of polygenic risk scores. Can they tell us something about course of illness and treatment outcomes across diagnostic categories? This is a project that I'm working on with my close colleague, Fernando Goes, in the Mood Disorder Center. In parallel, we've been working on trying to develop ways of capturing other digital phenotype data on our patients to extend our ability to measure how our patients are doing beyond the point of care and what's often called the clinical white space when they're out there in the wild, either through a mobile app that we've developed or through online social media tracking. We have 2 different projects in both those spheres, and another time I can talk about those projects. This idea of extending the measurement-based care program and extending and enriching the learning health system. The third goal is to expand this learning health system to the entire Department of Psychiatry here downtown and Bayview and across the whole Johns Hopkins Clinical Research Network to expand the number of patients that we're following, both as part of standard of care to improve care and also to engage them in this learning health system. And finally, some of you know that there is this School of Medicine Precision Medicine Center of Excellence Initiative. Scott Ziegler, who many of us know, has been heavily involved in that. That's really motivated by the same idea I've been talking about here. We want to integrate with them what we're doing in psychiatry and ultimately use the PMAP platform that they've been developing as a platform for pulling all this data together. We see this as just the beginning and a lot of possibilities for taking advantage of it. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the second effort. So the Bayview, the Department of Psychiatry, My Care effort is really an effort to go wide across disorders. We know that many of these disorders, there's lots of commonalities between bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia. So we wanted to create a learning health system across disorders in the Department of Psychiatry. The work with the NNDC and the Mood Outcomes Program is this effort now to go deep, to focus on mood disorders, which is my area of interest, on depression and bipolar disorder, to create a learning health system, now not at Hopkins, but across the country with all these institutions that are part of the National Network of Depression Centers. This is a consortium of 26 academic centers around the country. You can see the ones listed here. And we've gotten together and we started to develop a measurement-based care program for mood disorders called the Mood Outcomes Program. We've all agreed across all these clinics that we're going to capture these patient-reported outcome measures as part of routine care every visit of our patients, the PHQ-9, the GAD-7, and the Columbia. We're doing that in Bayview, and they're going to be doing that at all the other centers across the NNDC. So we have these standardized, harmonized measures that we can pull together into our database and start the beginning of a learning health system across the country for mood disorders. We've actually started in 2015 planning, implementing, and as of December 2018, we hit our milestone of having 10,000 patients across the country who were part of the Mood Outcomes Program that we've developed. This is just some data from the first data freeze from those patients that have been part of the program. You can see that over 50% have more than one follow-up. The mean number of visits is around 5 for those with bipolar disorder and depression. They've been followed for around 9 to 12 months on average. We have some people who've been followed now for 2 or 3 years with longitudinal data. And we've started to look at longitudinal measures based on the PHQ-9 and GAD-7 across this cohort of patients that we're following. I am going to skip ahead just because of time. This is just real quickly what we're looking at here is we looked at our patients who entered into the program with an active depression as defined by having a PHQ score of 10 or higher, and following the percentage that were still active after 2 years of follow-up. And this is stratified by their GAD score, their anxiety. So in blue, these are patients who had low anxiety scores, who are clearly doing better, and those with high anxiety scores at baseline are doing worse over time. This, again, is just a descriptive first look at the data that we're pulling together from this effort to work together. What we're really excited about is our next step of the creating this learning health system is to expand what we're doing. So we're capturing these standardized patient-reported outcome measures as standard of care. We now want to be able to pull from the Epic electronic medical record other clinical data on encounters, problem lists, diagnoses, medications, procedures, labs, and to share that centrally so that we'll have a richer database to look at some of the questions and really create this as a platform for doing large-scale quality improvement and multi-site research studies across the centers around the country. So we are excited about it, and really we've seen the first dividends of this effort after 5-6 years of working together. We got our first grant funded in the fall. It's a joint R01 to leverage the infrastructure that we've created in the NNDC to do a genetic study of severe treatment-resistant depression treated by ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. Many of you may know that ECT is a remarkably effective treatment that we use for patients who are either having life-threatening depression or who have failed other treatments, other standard treatments for depression. And then they'll come in and they'll get ECT, and it turns out to be one of our more effective treatments for depression. So the idea, the motivation for this study was, let's use this as a way to get patients who have severe depression to look at the genetic architecture of that severe depression. What are the genetic risk factors that contribute to severe depression? And how does that differ from the common depression we see in the population where we believe there's a lot of heterogeneity? And importantly, can we use that information to look at genetic predictors of response to ECT? Because again, not everybody responds well to electroconvulsive therapy. So can we use this as a platform? So we got funding to recruit 25,000 patients. Now we're talking about large number of patients, no longer 600 patients. We're talking about 25,000 patients with depression treated by ECT. We're going to carry out a GWAS of depression treated by ECT to look at the severe depression, and also a GWAS of response to ECT. This grant could not have been done without the work that we started with the NNDC in that mood outcomes program. We're going to be getting standardized patient-reported outcome measures on our patients as they come into the ECT centers. We're also working to harmonize across the centers how clinicians document that ECT, so we have other variables to look at in terms of the ECT that is delivered, so that all that we're doing as part of this study is we're consenting the patient and we're getting a blood sample. And we get that blood sample when they get stuck for IV for the ECT. The rest of the data comes from the electronic medical record that we've harmonized as part of this initial effort. So hopefully you can see that this is starting, I hope, to build an infrastructure which will really get us to come full circle to thinking about how we can do the genetics of lithium study that I started off in the beginning, where we really had troubles. I'm hoping that we can leverage this infrastructure that we've been building to really get at that question that has eluded us thus far. So I'm not naive. I know there are a lot of problems with this approach, and there are several challenges, and I'll quickly go through some of those challenges that I know that are out there. There are 4 key challenges for this idea of using a learning health system for mental health. The first is not all patients who need treatment receive it in our healthcare system. We're in a school of public health. I said my intellectual home is a school of public health. I know this. Not everybody, we've studied that there is a selection bias. Not everybody makes it to the healthcare center. Now, hopefully I'm dealing with severe mental illnesses and that's less of an issue, but that then does bring up the second challenge. The healthcare system in the US is so fragmented. The idea of being able to pull data together across all these centers is really challenging. I may have patients getting ECT here across the street, but they are receiving care at other centers around Baltimore, and that data is lost to me. Is there a way to pull all that data together? It's a fragmented system and it's difficult. The third challenge, Electronic medical record data is not the greatest. It was initially built for administrative or billing purposes. They like to say garbage in, garbage out, and that's a real concern. I've actually been spending a lot of effort. I think this is a problem, not only for doing this kind of work, but I think it's a problem clinically. So I've been working a lot with the Department of Psychiatry. How can we do what we're doing in the electronic medical record as part of improving care? Because they are using that information for clinical care. So let's improve it for clinical care, and at the same time, hopefully address this problem for research that we want to do. And then finally, I'll end on, there are serious, significant ethical challenges with trying to use patient data responsibly. How can we use patient data that we're collecting responsibly without completely hamstringing scientific progress? Those two things are often at tension as well, unfortunately. And so how can we do that responsibly? So 2 more slides, because I know we're coming up near the end of the time. I do think the ethical challenges are interesting, really interesting, and worth considering a lot about. There are 3 that we wrestle with. The first is patient confidentiality. I mean, we could try to de-identify the data that we collect, and there are HIPAA guidelines for how to de-identify it. But if you have enough information on any individual, you can re-identify that patient. So really, is there any such thing as de-identified data? And the School of Medicine worries about this, and they worry about HIPAA. And they come to me with, they especially worry when they see news announcements like this. I don't know if you've seen this. Google recently published a paper, which I think was one of the best papers I've read in the last 5 years, actually. They used electronic medical record data from 2 large healthcare systems. They pulled it together, and their AI team used their AI algorithms to try to predict outcomes, clinical outcomes from the electronic medical record data. Really interesting paper. Not too much longer after that paper came out, turns out University of Chicago was one of those centers that donated data to that study, and they're being sued with Google for sharing the data. Apparently, they didn't strip away all the identifying information like dates. It's a real concern. I don't mean to belittle it, but it's how can you do this kind of work and get around this kind of issue? So it's a challenge. The second, is actionable findings. Now, we do measurement-based care because we want actionable findings. But if you get lots and lots of data, there'll be lots of information in there, and you can't always act on it. And what happens if somebody does something bad and you didn't act on it and you have that information in your hands? Are you liable for that? And that's a real problem. We encountered that from the very beginning with the PHQ-9, which many of you may be familiar with the story. We wanted to get this PHQ-9 as part of routine care. Item 9 asks if they have any thoughts about suicide. There was a worry if that questionnaire went out the day before or 2 days before and a patient endorsed yes, and it came into our data repository and nobody looked at it and the patient committed suicide, is the School of Medicine liable for that? Now, I don't know whether that ever happened, but we spent a lot of time whether there's ever been a use case of that, but we spent a lot of time wringing our hands over how to address that issue. And finally, the third major issue here is, who owns the data? Is it the patient's data, or is it the hospital's data that's collected the data? And more importantly, who owns the intellectual property off that data? Who can profit from that data if they come up with a product that uses that data? Is it all right for the Hopkins to patent a product off of using the data and doesn't share it with their patients? And looming large is the whole Henrietta Lacks story over this. It's the same issue, but now we're talking about data. These are real challenging ethical questions that we're struggling with to try to how to solve to this day and work through. And so I'll end with this last slide. This is a summary model, and I really think it describes, sadly, my life over the last 10 years in one cartoon figure, what I've been trying to build over the last 5 years. This idea that we're going to use measurement-based care as an engine for a learning health system and mental health that will drive discovery of what causes our patients to do well, and then to use that as a platform for translating that into improved outcomes to drive precision psychiatry. This encapsulates what I've been working on over the past 5 years. And I ended with some of the challenges because they're real challenges. It's been a slog over the last 5 years to try to get there. There's the technical challenges and there's ethical challenges. But I do think it's important because we have patients out there who are suffering. And this is a picture of my mom who has schizoaffective bipolar disorder, who I think about when I work on this. Sorry, I get a little emotional. So acknowledgements. So it's been real interesting work, real challenging work, and there's a lot of people to thank. There's the folks in the Mood Disorder Center and the leadership of the Department of Psychiatry who put out funds to support this kind of work. Jimmy Padash and Costas Lakesso was also very supportive. The NNDC and Ray DiPaolo, who leads that. And the My Care team, Diana Gumas and Bonnie Wood, and really the folks who actually do the work is Jason Straub, Pratima Kashetari, Michael Van Wert, and Michael Morial, and Kara Glazer, who was also very instrumental in all the work that we've been doing. And really, I didn't put it up here, but I should say, I do want to thank the Department of Mental Health because they really have been the intellectual home for all this work that's been done up until now, and for Danny's support. So thanks, I'll end there. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, Peter, and I love the way you laid out the evolution of your work. It's so interesting to see that. Great job.
Thanks.
Actually, I was going to ask you a question, and the picture of your mom really gets to it.
Yeah, sorry, I got choked up there. That was
that
was lame.
But,
sorry.
My question was going to be, of all the buzzwords you used,
Yeah.
I didn't hear patient-centered care, patient-centered outcomes.
Yep.
And could you talk a little bit about how you...
That's actually why I put my mom there at the end, and to tribute, because everything I do think about her. I mean, we're all patients. So I do think very heavily about, there's two parts to the question of patient. There is the part of patient-engaged care. I think it's important. I think measurement-based care, I didn't have time to go into it, but one of its benefits is it really engages the patient in their own care. They become active participants in their own care. And I think that's important. So that's the point one. And then the second point is the ethical issues around we're collecting this data, and then how can we use this data to drive discovery in a way that is responsible to the patients?
Yep.
I don't know the answers to those questions. I'm struggling with those, but I do keep them in mind with all the work that we do.
Do you engage patients in in the design of your research?
Yes. So as part of the NNDC, we have several patient advocates who were crucially involved when we were developing the mood outcomes program. And in the My Care program, we've also had patient advocates as well who've been talking with about the program. Yeah, thanks.
Questions? Yes, Karen.
Karen, use the microphone, please.
So my question goes to the role of public health.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So role of public health in the learning healthcare part of what you're thinking about particularly.
Yeah.
So I imagine that medicine would say that's the future of medicine. But given that you have an intellectual home in public health, what do you see as a special role, if any, for public health in that work?
So I don't divide the world into medicine and public health. I think that this is squarely under the umbrella of public health. I want to reduce the burden of the population of patients with bipolar disorder and serious mental illnesses. So I want to understand what causes them to have the disorder and what can we do to better to treat them. So the learning health system is a mechanism by which to achieve that very real public health goal. So I don't know whether it's useful to divide the world into the School of Medicine and public health. That's why I like to live in both worlds and like to have straddle both worlds, because I think it's important that we don't think of fiefdoms, that we're working together on the same problem. Yeah. I didn't mean to imply that you were that you were talking about as a fiefdom, but because I think of these as the same ball of wax, to use a bad metaphor.
Becky?
Thank you, Peter, for a great presentation. My question is a little tangential maybe, but I'm curious, so even if we can improve sort of the prediction and like sort of the matching of treatments to patient characteristics, we're still sort of seeing that the treatments we have are not great, right? Especially for serious mental disorders. And so I'm curious what you think on sort of novel treatments like ketamine and like psychedelics and what the role of those is in the work you're doing.
Yeah, so both ketamine and psilocybin, so we're actively engaged with folks in ketamine who are setting up ketamine. So folks might not know, ketamine is the street drug, first of all, but it turns out to have remarkably fast-acting antidepressant effects, much like ECT. And it's recently been approved for a nasal spray as ketamine for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. And there is a lot of interest in ketamine as a fast-acting antidepressant that might be useful where other treatments have failed. And so it has been approved by the FDA, but we really don't have a whole lot of data long-term on esketamine. We don't have a whole lot of data of who responds well and who doesn't. So I actually think that what we're doing here is key, is fundamental to understand that. And so as part of the NNDC, in fact, in a week, we have a call with all the centers that are starting, because all these centers are starting up esketamine clinics, because it just got approved. A lot of challenges. mostly dealing with billing. But there's a lot of challenges setting up those clinics. But what we're doing is from the get-go, we are working with those clinics to create the clinical documentation and the algorithm and the workflows so that we're going to collect harmonized data on all our patients across the NNDC who are getting esketamine from the start of treatment, so that we will be able to collect data them going forward, so that we will be able to speak intelligently about what is the impact of esketamine. Is this really a good drug? Should we be using it more widely? What are the long-term consequences? If we don't do this kind of thing, it's a waste. And so I think what we're doing, we're actually taking that ECT model that I talked about and doing the exact same thing for esketamine. We haven't done it yet, but we're going to talk with psilocybin folks as well, because that will be of interest as well. So it's, a lot of my work, sadly, is also plug and chug. One good idea, just replicate it 100 times. So we're doing the same idea for RTMS. RTMS is another treatment modality for treatment-resistant antidepressant. So we're working with all the RTMS clinics across NNDC. These are leading centers who are using these treatments, and we're not following them or collecting data. So the idea is to use this model to be able to do that. So hopefully in a year's time, we'll have some data to be able to talk about that.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing the data in a year. We'll have to get you back here.
Right.
All right. Well, again, join me in thanking Peter for a fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
And also join us by the Wall of Wonder for a reception. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.